Hello, everyone. My name is Gian-Carlo Carra. I'm a little bit stuffed up, COVID negative though. I am the city councillor for the great East Calgary neighborhoods of Ward 9 and your candidate for re-election in this extremely important election coming up on October 18th of this year. Because this is such an important election, and because we're in a global pandemic, we conceptualized how we would run a campaign more digitally. And one of the things that we wanted to do, both to respect, the need to stay distanced from each other, and now we've opened everything up, and it now looks like we're getting crushed by a fourth wave, but also to really have important conversations about our best future as a city, as I said, at this most critical election point. We developed the conversations with Carra, and I think today we've had a ton of amazing conversations. Today we're having a conversation about an anti-racist city, and I'm going to just say this is not a conversation with Carra. This is a conversation with Campbell, and I'm going to be along for the ride. Heather Campbell is amazing. Before I begin and give you a minor introduction and then let you introduce yourself, Heather, I do want to do a land acknowledgement, because in Canada, there is no anti-racism that is not built on a foundation of truth and reconciliation. And one of the small but important symbolic acts that we are committed to doing is to decolonize the history we tell about ourselves as the city of Calgary. And so I think we used to say, we used to think just mindlessly that a project of building community on this land began with Euro-Canadian settlement 130 years ago. But we know that that is not true. And what we do acknowledge now is that the act of building community on this land began in time immemorial. With the signatories of Treaty 7, the Indigenous people, the Tsitapi, the Blackfoot people, the Aye Nakota, the mountain people, the Stony Nakota people, the Tsuut'ina people, the Beaver people, with the Métis people and their long history on this land, and now with urban Aboriginals from across Turtle Island who we live with in the city of Calgary. Euro-Canadian and now international Canadian settlement of this land and the act of building community began with signing a peace treaty where we agreed we would continue the act of building community together. And so we acknowledge that as a much more compelling and realistic truth which to start any meeting, and specifically this meeting, a conversation about an anti-racist city. So I'm unbelievably honored to be joined by the amazing Heather Campbell, my friend, my neighbor in Inglewood for many, many, many years. I'm the one who's not living in Inglewood right now, and you're still a stalwart there. Heather, besides being obviously a woman of color, you are someone who's amazingly prepared and the right person to have this conversation with. But why don't you tell me why?
We're having this conversation. I'm joining you from Arts Commons today, this evening, because of course I wasn't as prepared as I normally am, and I double booked myself with conversations with Carra and Arts Commons, where I'm on the board of Calgary's Performing Arts Centre, and we're having a first live performance with the city and trying to figure out how to welcome everyone, and that means everyone in Calgary back, and have Arts Commons be truly the commons and a place and a home for all Calgarians, where it is their art center. I'm still here in Calgary, where I live as a guest on the traditional territories of Treaty 7 nations in Southern Alberta and Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. And why are we having a conversation about an anti-racist Calgary? Because it's about time. The Prime Minister, the Liberal leader, used to say, well, it's 2015. And I would say this is a conversation that people that look like me have been having for a long time and shouting into the wind. And unfortunately, several people were murdered in recent history in the US and in Canada. And their murders had racist undertones and overtones and layers and all of the descriptive words you'd want to use there. And the rest of Canada and the rest of Alberta and the rest of Calgary couldn't not see it and started to listen. So I think that's why we're having a conversation.
Well, I agree with you. You know, I was there as the chair of Community and Protective Services when Black Lives Matter exploded onto the world stage and people rose up in solidarity in Calgary. And the conversation was very clear that we have to take this conversation from the streets into the halls of our city government. So, you know,
well, and Gian-Carlo, I would big you up for doing it. There were a lot of folks who said, don't do this conversation, those 3 days of hearings. Don't do this conversation this way. Don't do this conversation now. There were a lot of folks who were unprepared to literally bare their soul in city council chambers. You were one of the few councillors who sat through all 3 days. I'm not going to call out people, but I know there were some who popped in and out and didn't really hear the words, didn't really hear the message, didn't really hear the pain, the suffering, the discrimination, the abuse. You heard it all. So I'm going to give you props and love for that, and we'll always respect you for pushing ahead and taking that lead. And I know there are those out there probably on this live stream who will disagree with me. Yeah, I don't actually care.
Well, I appreciate that, Heather, and I'll tell you, you know, I went into that very aware that the theory of systemic racism that I understand and I understood, and the practice, I was going to experience a significant, you know, theory practice coming together, and that was really the role. And you know, I was very concerned about, you know, re-traumatizing. I was very concerned about the performative aspects of that, but I was also very aware that this was a conversation that needed to be had. I mean, I was amazed at how, I honestly think that it's one of the silver linings of COVID-19, where we were forced apart in order to take care of one another. And then when we were sitting alone and we're able to really focus on the ubiquity of things like the murder of George Floyd.
Honestly, if it weren't for lockdown, how many senior executives would have been home with the TV on in the background while they were working, watching that? Yeah. How many would have seen it? Yeah. Like, how many now use the word racism that never that word never crossed their lips before? Like, I use the word racism a lot because I don't mince words and I don't know how to talk about racism without saying racism. But there's a lot of people in this town who never uttered the word racism before last summer.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, it is a historic moment where we have the opportunity to make real change. And we're a year out from that, and some things have been going well, and some things have yet to land as well as they need to. And there's a lot of work to be done ahead, a lot of work. And so I wanted to sort of structure this conversation with you, sort of like, how did we get here? And we've started to dig into that, but maybe not to the extent we want to. Then I want to talk about where is here, because I think we're in a very dicey and very opportunistic and very hopeful, but also very problematic moment. And then where do we go in order to get to an anti-racist city, which is something that I'm totally committed to, and my platform, my re-election movement, it's the leading proposition, an anti-racist city.
So how did we get here?
Yeah, can we talk a little bit, because I know you, before this all happened, you sat on the Alberta government's anti-racism committee, or what was the name of that committee, and how did
that was the Alberta Anti-Racism Advisory Council. So I was appointed co-chair, in February 2019. I had a 2-year term, so my term came to a close on January 27th, 2021. I would suggest that there are those.
Calgary Police Commission, right?
It overlapped for about 2 months, but I think I would say that there are folks within government who are pretty happy that my term is finished. I said the things that needed to be said. We identified as a council, and it was a council across Alberta. So we had members from Fort McMurray all the way to Lethbridge. My other co-chair, Dr. Lucinia Ortiz, former co-chair, of course now, was based in Edmonton. And we identified 4 key priorities for work that we were looking at, and it was work on education. Including anti-racist principles in education across the board from K to post-secondary. So all of the stuff we're seeing with the provincial curriculum right now, we actually provided the government notes on how not to do that. So, we'll sit there. Well, I speak loudly and I speak quite articulately and I speak both official languages, but apparently, it doesn't matter how many different languages you speak and how articulate you are. If someone doesn't want to hear you, you're not heard. And that's what we'll say about that. But, I think.
What was education?
Go ahead.
Yeah, what was education? What were the other points?
We looked at valuing internationally trained professionals and workers. So, it's the doctors driving taxis issue, but across the board. So every professional regulatory body, so physicians, pharmacists, engineers. You think about it, if I can say this as a licensed professional engineer in this province, if you're trained overseas, and there's only a select number of countries where you can do a direct transfer of your engineering credentials to be able to obtain your PN here in Alberta. Basically, they make you write the equivalent of your 4th-year exams if you actually have to challenge the professional exams. Well, most engineers didn't do well on their 4th-year exams the first time they wrote them, much less 15 years after they were practicing. But that's the expectation. And it's not about, when you're looking at something like that, it's not about professional talent and competency. Let's remember that in this province, much of the detailed design and engineering work is actually done in India and overseas and other countries overseas. So the competency is there because clearly the industrial facilities that we build work. So it's about protectionism and underlying racism. The other 2 areas that we looked at were hate and bias crimes and the creation of a provincial hate crimes unit. And 4th was an Alberta Public Service and an Alberta government that looks like Alberta. So in looking at the diversity and inclusion within Alberta government as well.
So I do want to talk about what happened to that report, but I also want to talk about how did the Advisory Council come into existence? Because it's a little bit ahead of its time, considering how new.
So the council came into existence. Was an outcome from the previous government, former Premier Notley, after the tragic events in Quebec in a mosque where several worshippers were murdered. They came out and said we need to look at racism in the province, and prepared a report. It was called Taking Action Against Racism. There were a number of recommendations in that report, and one of them was to create an anti-racism advisory council. So that council was created, and I was appointed to it in February of 2019. We started the work, and then we had an election in May of 2019, which changed government. And it took quite a bit of time to get the new government to be responsive to the idea of continuing to look at anti-racism as a principle. The council was in a really challenging position. Social justice and racial justice matters were exploding across the province and across the world in the summer of 2020. And as a council, we were asked to be silent. And it was really challenging. We weren't, but it was challenging. We worked really hard that summer. We prepared a report with recommendations in those 4 areas I spoke about earlier. That report was provided to government, to the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women, former minister now, Leela here, in January of 2021. And it sat. And until some fairly substantial incidents happened again, and the recommendations in a redacted form were released. The report had some fairly substantial items in there that were not included in the recommendations that were released, but that's because it was probably too true.
Well, I mean, so this is an interesting thing. We've got a city government that is responding to Black Lives Matter exploding on the streets of Calgary, and we're going in one direction, and you've got a change of government at the provincial level, and going from a fairly proactive stance from the previous government to a very sort of suppressive stance by this government, sort of going in the opposite direction of where the rest of us, or where a lot of us are going. And the politicization of racism is a fascinating thing that's taking place right now, and it's sort of what I talk about. That's sort of where we are. Where is here? Where we are right now.
I think a perfect example of exactly that is if we were to talk about the secularism laws in Quebec, right? Calgary City Council had a unanimous vote to oppose Quebec's secularism law, so Bill 21, that's what we're talking about, and defend Calgarians' right to wear religious symbols and articles of faith under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And they'd had that in September 2019. And that was historic, and it was brave, and it was resolute leadership by Calgary City Council. And I'll always say bravo about that. But others should be standing beside Calgary in that same amount of voice and strength. Like, how are we really talking about secularism laws in this time and space? And let's be completely transparent. Like, those are very much about preventing Muslim women who wear the hijab from working in the public sector. It's ridiculous, it's Islamophobic, and we should fight it on every single front. We still have leaders in Quebec openly denying the existence of systemic racism. Like, the minister of, I think it's like basically of like dealing with racism in Quebec denies that there's systemic racism. Like, what are we actually talking about, right? This is happening today. Like they were like, the inquiry into the death of the late Ms. Joyce Esaquan was happening in the courthouse in Joliet, and you had the minister denying the existence of systemic racism. Like,
I share your frustration.
Sorry.
I would like to sort of
yellow.
ratchet this a little bit closer to home, because it's nice to sort of tune on Quebec from an Alberta perspective, to tune on the Quebecois. But let's unpack where we are here. And so
So let's unpack where we are as Albertans.
Yeah,
we have Muslim women being attacked, racialized Muslim women being attacked in the streets. And the provincial government basically says, well, you should apply for a grant, but not until October, to make adjustments for security adjustments to buy security cameras for your mosque. And you might want to look at some pepper spray, so open carry, which even the police have said, yeah, wrong answer. We have Ooh,
Confederate
we
flags
have
flying over Union Cemetery. We have
we have Confederate flags flying over Union Cemetery. We have Confederate flags for available for purchase in Calgary. Who needs a Confederate flag in Calgary? The answer is no one.
I hosted a event in Ogden this past Saturday, part of our community parades and celebrations. And I actually had protesters show up to that event sporting white supremacist gear, flying a banner of Kevin J. Johnson, if you can sort of wrap your mind around that. And the other thing is we had a couple of Indigenous people in the celebration with us, and they had this group of white supremacists who are on the outskirts of our event, sort of protesting our community celebration. They had a missing and murdered Indigenous woman symbol that they had sort of taken into their sort of propaganda displays and sort of like taken as their own. So yeah.
But you see, like, you know what? Like, go back a couple of years. You remember when there was a rally around the carbon tax, and I'm going to say circa 2016, 2017. And what got trotted out in front of City Hall for that? A big honking Confederate flag. Now, what in the world does that have to do with carbon tax?
No.
So why, like, we need to ask ourselves, why is it that straight up white supremacists and hate groups attach themselves to concepts and challenges and protests of that nature? Same thing like the anti-mask. Like, you and I dealt with this as commissioners with the Calgary Police Commission. Like, why is it that the white supremacists tagged on to the anti-mask rallies?
So
like, why are we afraid to ask ourselves that question? What is it about these issues?
I'll throw out a couple things. So right before the lockdown, there were two history professors at Yale University who produced a book, and I'm spacing on their names, but the book was called How Democracies Die. And the thesis that they put forward was that there is no democracy in the Western tradition that has successfully survived the transition from the founding cultural, ethnic majority into a plurality within their within their society. And their argument is that when that founding cultural group is numerically challenged by other members of their society, rather than share power democratically, pluralistically, they dismantle the democracy in order to stay in charge. And their argument is that's exactly what's happening in Western democracies now with the rise of Trumpianism and Brexit. And I think a lot of the political techniques being used by our current provincial government, they are going from dog whistles to actual audible whistles that people can hear.
It's not even a whistle. It's like, please, here's the door. It says racism on it. Come on in.
So I mean, I think that is taking place, and I think it's a political strategy, and I think that some of the people who are employing those political strategies in their hearts are doing that overtly. I think some of them are just politicians who see a path to power, and we have other challenges with our democracy, and that is that the periodic competition for ideas for the right to govern is now being usurped by the competition, and people are no longer competing for the right to govern. They're governing as an act of constant competition, and they see a pathway to victory here. So I think there's a lot of toxic things taking place within the democratic sphere, and I think that is colliding with this, shift that's taking place within our society, where a lot of us are saying, I don't want to be part of a racist society. I want to be part of an, equitable, diverse, pluralistic project of civilization, and I'm proud to be Canadian. Or I'm proud to be, American, and that's what was driving Black Lives Matter and all of those things. And I think where I believe where we are right now, and you can call bullshit on this or not, But I think that we have three groups of Calgarians right now, and there are the Calgarians who understand that systemic racism is a real thing, and it is our duty to dismantle it. There are those who don't know that yet and haven't learned, and they're just waking up to that, and their hearts are just opening up to it. But there's a third group that, whether they understand it or not, are committed to maintaining, their privilege, maintaining the systems of oppression that keep them on top. And that, I think, is driving a lot of the overt racism that we're seeing too. So I think there's a lot of these things happening.
When I talk about anti-racism, and I talk about racism, and I talk about equity and diversity and inclusion and all of that, I often show a picture of a board table, because it's in a corporate context, that's where it really comes home. And it's this idea, if you're talking about the first group, that group that is like, I have to lose something for someone who looks like me to be in that place. No, every single board table in this city in Calgary is big enough for another seat. We need to rid ourselves of the expectation that by celebrating and including me as a part of the discussion, as a part of the decision making, as a part of the economic prosperity, that somehow someone who looks like you, GC, loses something. I can't buy into that because it's not true. I think having me at the table makes your decision making and makes your perspective actually better.
I 100% agree, Heather. And as you know, long before Black Lives Matter exploded and we started talking about anti-racism, I was proud to lead gender equity and diversity movements through council, and we established the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee through that work. But gender equity and diversity, and talking about an Alberta that reflects Albertans and a city of Calgary that reflects Calgarians, that is important. But anti-racism is next level, or it's at least a lot more explicit about the challenges that we're facing.
So let's go there. So racism, we're gonna go there. Like, racism is about you over me. It's about denying people the opportunity to thrive and prosper. It's about denying a person their human dignity. Racism is an economic issue. When you think about it, remember we were talking about, you're unable to actually perform your main d'oeuvre, your training. You've been trained as a medical physician. Like, we're in the middle of a health crisis, and we have doctors who can't practice. And we have a shortage of physicians, and we have people here who cannot practice because we haven't figured out how to actually properly license them.
But include them, yeah.
Okay. As a counselor, your entire job is the health, well-being, and prosperity of Calgarians. That's your job. Like, those are the metrics right there. Racism impacts every single one of those. Racism and anti-racism is your job if you're a counselor. QED. Sorry.
I agree. I'll tell you, that 3-day inquiry into systemic racism, theoretically I understood, but when like 200 members of our community who were BIPOC stood up, and it didn't matter what their age was, it didn't matter what their racialized background was, it didn't matter what their economic status was, it didn't matter what their newness to Canada was. People who were born here, people who were just, every single one of the people who stood up and shared with us an unbelievably harrowing and impactful story about how the key institutions that we all rely upon do not treat them the same as they treat me. Policing, education, health, transit, everything. You know, and that's to me unacceptable. And how do we get? I mean, I realize that I have to talk about this, but we need everybody talking about this, and we need to make it go away, and we need to build an equitable society.
So I think some of it is, again, awareness, right? Until you are aware of the microaggressions
What is
and
microaggression? Because
so a
Black people
microaggression.
know that. I'm not sure all white people understand what that is.
Okay, so maybe I'll go to maybe I'll talk about my favorite microaggression. So it's this idea where it is a subtle, smaller, I'm going to say perhaps involuntary form of racism that a person acts on with a person of color or other. So my favorite microaggression, and favorite with all of the air quotes around it, is but where are you really from? So if I'm in a cheeky mood, my answer is typically my mother's womb with the assistance of St. Mary's Hospital, Montreal. So at that point, the questioner comes to realize that I'm Canadian, and their face often reveals just outright disappointment, because they needed for me to be an outsider. They needed to demonstrate my unbelonging. They needed to other me. That I'm a Canadian and a Montrealer at that, it leaves me feeling defeated, because I now have to give an account of my Canadian credentials. Why? Now, it seems naively curious, because most folks when I talk about this as a microaggression, they say, well, no, they just really want to know who you are. And I'm like, so you know what? You could ask that question differently. You could say, who are your people? Where do you call home? But it's galling and offensive. And I wonder, I'm always left wondering, what about me says not Canadian? Is it my gender? Is it my command of both official languages? And you know I'm being facetious here, because you know what it is. You know it's that I'm a Black woman. And what does that person who's asking me the question gain by making me the other? Right? So even in this province, very much so in this province, and if you look at the policy and the commentary that comes out of the Department of Culture, Multiculturalism, and Status of Women, there is this underlying myth that racism only happens to immigrants. Even that is an othering. And we know it's a myth because of the extreme amounts of racism and systemic racism that's experienced by Indigenous communities, the original peoples of this land. So,
I mean, we're getting some questions from Facebook.
Sorry, I'm giving you essay answers.
Great. I think this is great, but I think that, you know, we're talking about overt racism, whether it's sort of, you know, microaggressions or whether it's actual acts of racism where, you know, someone's attacked, a hijabi woman is attacked in our park system by some asshole. Or somebody breaks into the Union Cemetery to fly a Confederate flag, you know.
But it's like, so the overt racism, yes, but you know, like, it is baked into our policy and legislation across the board. Like, even things that you would not think have anything to do with racism and race.
I know you've got a great example from like forestry. Drop it on us. Drop it on us.
Okay, so just part of my gig, right? So Section 17.6 of the Saskatchewan Forest Resources Management Act is my favorite example of the way we embed our bias and discrimination into our way of being, okay? It gets me into a ton of trouble every time I use it. So I'm gonna start with a disclaimer.
Let's get into trouble.
Let's get into trouble, good trouble. I am not trying to cancel Christmas. That's my opener. Okay, so section 17 sub 6 reads, a person may, without license, harvest a reasonable number of trees for his or her personal use only if A, the trees are harvested for the purpose of being used as a Christmas tree, B, each tree does not exceed a height of 4 meters, and C, the trees are not the result of actions or activities undertaken by the ministry or by a licensee pursuant to the requirements of this act, the regulations, or the code. Okay, so why a person needs a 13-foot Christmas tree is beyond me, but the part you really need to pay attention to is that no other religious or traditional use is provided or contemplated here in the legislation, just Christmas.
So this is a war on Christmas is what you're talking about.
No,
I know.
I'm saying, if you take this matter further and you consider the connection that Indigenous communities have to the land, a person could easily create the argument that we assault the land and harm others to celebrate the birth of Jesus. That ain't cool.
Well, that's just one.
So now I've officially started the war on Christmas. Let the calls commence.
Well, I mean, look, as someone
there's stuff like that all over the place.
Yeah. There is stuff like that all over the place. And I'll tell you what and I encourage everyone who's watching this, if you have not spent the time to listen, because it's on the internet, our inquiry into systemic racism will change you. And if you're on the fence and you're not sure whether you buy or get this systemic racism thing that you want to, plug into it, check out that inquiry, because we heard testimonial from everybody across the spectrum of our BIPOC community. And I'll tell you, Calgary is now the third most diverse city in Canada. 37% of our population is BIPOC and growing. And it's going to be 50% in a generation. And
so the question that we've gotten that how can people who are part of the systemic racist system move from being a part of the problem to a part of the solution? For me, it's being engaged. It's being engaged. It's recognizing human dignity. It's being aware of not necessarily your individual participation, but being aware of the history of the country, of our people, of organizations, of institutions. I think it's the struggle that, GC, you and I are having right now as commissioners.
we need to talk about that.
Yeah, it's the struggle that an organization like Calgary Police Service, who is doing the work, I will not disparage them. They are doing the work, but it's hard because they're trying to transform an organization that has its roots in racism. Like, that is the history of policing in this country. And we're asking them quite fairly and quite reasonably to transform. So I think there's a level of patience, but also recognition that this is where we've come from, and we have to understand our history and acknowledge it. And that's part of when we consider Indigenous communities, that's the basis of truth and reconciliation.
So understanding the truth is
understanding the truth.
There's a lot of truths that we suppress, that we don't understand, that we haven't confronted, that we absolutely need to. Then there's sort of like the immediate action, and what the city of Calgary has done, because after that inquiry into systemic racism, council declared we have a systemic racism problem in the city and its institutions, including the police. And we need to do something about it. And so, we've set up an anti-racism function within the city manager's office that is hopefully at that sort of command level as we reorg, as we do everything. We've set up the Anti-Racism Action Committee that works as a three-legged stool with the Social Wellbeing Advisory Committee and with the Calgary Urban Aboriginal Advisory Committee. And those committees have to really be resourced and have the capacity to weigh in on all of the decision making that council makes. We've committed to a Calgary that reflects Calgarians. But now we got to get into the defund the police thing, because you and me, Councillor Chahal, were appointed by council, the police commission, to really roll up our sleeves and begin to work. And the police have established their own anti-racism action committee, and we have an anti-racism committee on a commission. So how's that going, Heather? Because it is because I will tell you, there was a bit of an anticlimactic debate on council after we declared anti-racism, and it was the procedural thing where we're like, oh, and the police want to be part of this too. And they want us to acknowledge on their behalf that there's systemic racism within the police service. And then there was a debate about, well, should we be talking about that because they haven't been part of these proceedings? And then we sort of like pulled all the wind out of our own sails by getting into this really stupid procedural argument about whether the police should be involved in this now or not. And the police were, and we acknowledged that on their behalf because they sent letters. But what we've learned as becoming commissioners is that whereas the leadership acknowledged this, the rank and file haven't quite wrapped their mind around it yet. And a year in, I'd say it's a struggle.
It's a struggle. I'm always going to say three things when we're talking about policing and anti-racism. So first of all, justice is more than just policing. Second, systemic racism exists in policing as it does throughout society. And then third, the statement and acknowledgement of systemic racism by Calgary Police was historic.
Yes. Yes.
And for me, those three things are fundamental, because it says that you can't just fix quote unquote policing and everything's going to be fine. We need to look at prosecution, the prosecutor's office. We need to look at the judiciary. We need to look at the human rights legislation, the Police Act. Like, don't even start. Well, you know what? You don't have to start me there. My views on that are all over Twitter. So anybody who wants to know what I think about that can just go look it up. But it's not just policing.
So let's talk about defund the police, because unfortunately we acknowledged as a council that systemic racism existed within the police service. We started to set up the process of defunding the police by accepting money from them out of their budget into something we had set up called the Community Safety Investment Framework, and that was going to start to develop alternative service delivery models, is what they talk about. But the basic idea, of course, is that when you pick up the phone to call 911 at 4 a.m. because there's a mental health crisis taking place in front of you, we send the police, not a psychologist, because the police are available 24/7 and psychologists aren't, or psychiatrists aren't, and social workers aren't.
And it's more that it's about creating an alternative response for 911 where you get a more equitable and more visible outcomes for communities of color and others that are disproportionately over-policed and impacted by the criminal justice system.
And I mean, the reality is that when
and we know that there are differences in the way vulnerable, marginalized, racialized communities are treated. This is a bit triggering for some, so I'm going to just give that warning right now. but I'm gonna go there. One of the things that's probably the hardest for me to read right now, but it's something that you're also reading, is the 1,109 page report called Missing and Missed from Toronto. And it was a review that was done by Justice Epstein on the concerns that were related to the MacArthur investigations in Toronto and Peel region. And simply that those investigations were damaged severely by systemic bias and discrimination. Community members felt that the Toronto Police remained uninterested in the disappearance of the victims until their friend, who was not a person of color, went missing. The full review is, pardon me?
And they solved the crime.
Well, it's hard to, can you imagine, 8 men who are brown and black and gay and refugees and immigrants and marginalized and vulnerable and all of the tags, and the police didn't look for them.
Yeah, I mean that's
so then you take that a bit further, and you're called to think about the thousands of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And you cannot help but ask, what has centuries of systemic racism played in their deaths and disappearances? The answer to that's obvious, right? But this is what I mean by it's not just policing.
100%.
We're talking about fundamental justice.
So I think with
sorry, I know you wanted to do defund the police, but I'm like, yeah, sorry.
No, but the reality is that the police are sent in to do a number of things that is not their job, right? And their arrival inadvertently criminalizes situations that are not criminal. And statistically, we know that the BIPOC community suffers the outcomes of the criminalization of issues that are not criminal. And we need to set up an emergency response system that sends actual experts to address the problems 24/7, 365, so that the police can focus on actual criminal matters and not inadvertently criminalize things. They also have to have the resources and care enough to go after criminal issues that are not, as per the MacArthur.
Well, and this is about transforming the entire system to provide accountability. We don't yet have justice, but justice isn't just policing. It's courts, it's corrections, it's the legislation itself. Something that you and I have also dealt with. Look how hard it is to prosecute a hate crime. That's redonkulous. Right?
I agree. So, obviously a lot of these things get into the Police Act. A lot of these get into the need to have provincial partners who are committed to these outcomes as well. But there are things we can do as Calgarians. And, number one is there was unfortunately a lot of sort of defund the police, defend the police politics taking place on council when it came time to put the money into the community safety investment framework. And that is not solved. And we are not building, a body of budget that can do the heavy lifting of developing these alternative response models and all of that stuff as well. And we have to do that. A core part of my platform, Rise Together. And that's one of the reasons why I'm running for re-election, is because I have made commitments, we've made commitments, and we have to deliver on them. And, I strongly believe that statements only go so far. Budgets is where it actually happens.
Nobody's got time for words anymore. It's all about action. I would say that the folks on council who were hell-bent to that they could not get to the place of defund need to get over the terminology and dig deeper and understand the principle. This is a first step with that reallocation. We'll see what work can be done. It was work that was done really fast, you know, with more time and more thought and more analysis and more.
And with our anti-racist advisory committees actually getting their feet underneath them and working cohesively.
You know, they were just starting at the same time, didn't have a lot of input yet, like all of that, right? Like, I have great hopes for what round 2, 3, and 4 can look like and can be, and the challenges and that it can solve in our community, and the strength that it can actually put back into Calgary Police Service and the Commission as their civilian oversight. Even simple things like we're even struggling now with how, like, we need to collect race-based data. That's a fundamental principle. And there are so many complexities with just doing what should not be hard. But, you know, we have to deal with the federal government. We got to deal with the RCMP because they set the criteria for this, that, and the other. And I'm like, come on.
We got a lot of work to do, and that's why I'm running.
It shouldn't be this hard.
Well, I mean, if we take to heart that it took generations and generations to establish these systems, you know, I would have loved to have been able to dismantle them in a day, but it's going to take a while. We need to, as you say, keep the truth front and center and talk about it. I just want to this is tangential. Like, I have people coming up and be like, oh, you're talking about racism because you just want to get reelected. I'm like, if I wanted to get reelected, I'm not sure talking about racism would be the best strategy. You know,
racism isn't a partisan issue. It's not a partisan issue, so it shouldn't.
Talk about that. It's not a partisan issue.
No, we've had racism under every stripe of government in the history of this country. So no, not a partisan issue.
So,
like, if you'd really like if you'd like to play that game, like, I can give you a racist incident for every premier and every prime minister in the history of Canada. Like, not a partisan issue. I think where we need to move are the steps forward together. Like, that's the opportunity. I'm always really frustrated after there is a large incident, typically tragic, and there are, you know, every leader's out there making apologies and, you know, standing beside the family in solidarity. You know, I think about all of the blackout statements that were made in May and June of 2020.
A lot of Black Instagram pages.
You know, and then fast forward a year, and what have all of those corporations done or said since? Time for words is over. Yeah. Action, because you're impacting my health, you're impacting my financial stability, you're impacting my wellness, my prosperity, because that's what racism impacts. So no, words, done. Action now.
So, as you know, I'm committed, and the big question is, how do we get more and more Calgarians awake, aware, and committed to that? We did a pipe ceremony this morning surrounding the memorialization of the children who didn't come home. And as you know, as every new body is discovered in the former residential school sites, the Bear Clan have been putting 2 children's shoes on the steps of City Hall. And there are a lot of shoes on the steps of City Hall now. And there's a conversation about whether that still fits. And so this pipe ceremony was the beginning of a conversation about how we take that memorial and turn it into something that's ongoing and that functionally works on the steps of City Hall. But the elder who spoke really said this is about love. This is about love and respect and honoring each other's basic human dignity. And I honestly think that that's how we're going to have to get there. We're going to have to somehow overcome this politics of anger, fear, and division and pursue love and bring everyone together around that.
It's amazing. I was going to say something else about the White Goose Flying Report and all of that, and our colleague Marilyn North Pagan, who was one of the composers of that report. But I'm going to go to that. I'm going to go back to the concept of love, and however you choose to worship in this space and in this place. We always talk about God. God is love, and we're always called to love one another as I have loved you. And in acts of racism, we subvert the requirements of, for at least for me as a Christian, the greatest of all commandments. It's a barrier to loving one another if we have racism full in front of us as an act. So, I go back to I think the elder called it exactly right. It's about love and about human dignity, and holding the world in a special, caring, loving embrace.
I think we're going to end it there, Heather. I think we've talked about an anti-racist city. I think we hit a lot of things. I think this is the beginning of a conversation that all of us need to have on an ongoing basis in order to fulfill our promise to one another as Canadians and as human beings. So this has been an amazing conversation with Campbell and Carra. And
Conversations with Campbell and Carra. Peace out. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.
Be well, everybody. Wash your hands, don't touch your face, wear a mask, distance, stay home if you're sick. Try your best, man. We're gonna get through this.
Love you, Heather. Thank you.
Take care.